Hi, good evening. I'm Tommy Murphy. I'm one of the Associate Directors of Residence Life, and I'm introducing our third speaker of the night, who is Professor Charles Chang. Professor Chang is an assistant professor in the linguistics program and the director of the Phonetics, Acquisition, and Multilingualism Lab. Prior to coming to BU, he taught at the University of Maryland, Rice University, and the University of London. His research focuses on the production and perception of speech categories in contexts of language contact, especially patterns of change in sounds of the native language throughout adulthood, effects of different types of language exposure, and the cognitive organization of multiple language systems. Professor Chang.
What I'd like to talk about today is how we remember and how we forget. In particular, how do we hold on to a language and how do we lose it? Or do we ever lose it? So what I'll be doing over the next several minutes is discussing kind of some headlines taken from the research literature, some research findings from the fields of linguistics and cognitive science that are beginning to address these questions systematically and kind of showing us the power of experience, linguistic exposure in some pretty fascinating ways. Now, language is an interesting thing from the perspective of memory because all of you clearly remember how to listen to English because you understand me. So it's kind of evident in the fact that you can understand what I'm saying right now. But when we talk about our first language, our native language, most of us don't really remember learning it because we actually started learning that language even before we were born in utero. That's kind of the first point at which we start to get exposed to our language, to hear it. So we learned our mother tongue implicitly before we really had any conscious recollection of that exposure, as opposed to through conscious effort. And this is in contrast to, probably what you remember from studying a foreign language in high school, where those foreign languages were learned explicitly through conscious and maybe sometimes painful work of memorizing verb conjugations, memorizing words. So that's kind of the background in which I'm going to be contextualizing some of these findings I'll be talking about. It would be reasonable, by the way, to consider learning foreign languages to be valuable because, as has been noted by many people in both the public and private sectors, language skills are essential already and are becoming more essential in many fields. And the US is currently in a bit of a language crisis with not enough people actually to meet the demand for certain languages. So there is a reason that a good school requires you to learn a foreign language. But that Spanish class or that French class that you worked so hard to pass in high school, how much did you retain from it? In other words, how quickly do you lose those second language skills that you worked so hard to develop? Now, most of you are probably thinking, pretty quick, just look at me, I'm a case in point. I don't remember anything from my high school Spanish class. But of course, we'd like to see more than just kind of anecdotal evidence of second language loss or attrition, what I'll be referring to as attrition. And we'd also like to know more about how quickly second language attrition happens because this would inform practical decisions about, for example, how often government officials need to be trained or re-exposed to a critical language that they have to use for their work. So many people have started to look at second language attrition systematically. And so the first study I'm going to be talking about is from a very recent study just published this year, 2016, by Carl Ridgway and colleagues out of the University of Colorado and Rosetta Stone. Now, Rosetta Stone you may be familiar with as the company that produces widely used suites of language learning software that nowadays you see in most bookstores, actually. So what these researchers did was a very, very large study. To investigate attrition, they looked at 125,000 learners of Spanish, and that's like a small city, 125,000 learners of Spanish who were using the Rosetta Stone software. And what they were doing was comparing the results of tests that the software administers to learners right after they study the material in a particular lesson. So there are kind of these review tests that are administered at the end of a unit, and then a bunch of other activities happen, and then they kind of take that review test on that material they learned in the lesson after some sort of time lag. So the idea is to compare the initial test on that material and the later test on that material and see how much worse, or whether there is any difference between the performance on those two tests. So what happened? This is what happened. So this is a plot that presents just one small piece of their results. So what you see on the y-axis are scores on the delayed test, the second test. And on the x-axis, what you see is the duration of the time lag relative to the initial test. So basically, how much time transpired from the initial test to the second test. And what you see basically is that is a pretty clear pattern. There's a pattern that's kind of consistent with the intuition that as time passes, you begin to forget things. And in this case, you begin to forget whatever you were supposed to learn in Spanish, level 2, unit 4, lesson 4. You begin to forget that, and you perform worse and worse on the delayed test the more time passes. Now, what's particularly interesting about this study is that not all lessons are created equal. And so what I mean by that, you can see kind of in this plot where it's the same type of data. So this is kind of generalizations over many, many different sets of data. But you basically see the same general patterns of forgetting for many different lessons. So each line here is representing the pattern of forgetting for a particular lesson. And what you notice, or what I want to point out, is that there's not a lot of crossing over between the lines. So this is sort of crucial because it's not like everything just goes to zero. So it's not like over time, as time passes, as 80 days passes, you forget everything and all of the things that you learned, all of the lessons that you studied in Rosetta Stone. Instead, the knowledge from different lessons is forgotten more or less quickly, depending on the lesson. And in general, what you see, the pattern is that the better the score on the initial test, which we can sort of interpret as reflecting having learned the material in that lesson better, the less quickly the knowledge from that lesson decays over time. Or to put it another way, the better you learn something in the short term, the better you remember it in the long term, is kind of the takeaway from this. But in any case, these findings are all on a language that people started learning later, which in most cases is going to remain people's weaker language. So maybe that is sort of to be expected. People kind of forget things that they didn't know super well to begin with. But what about your first language? Because your first language you are an expert in. People generally consider themselves very, very strong in their native language that they acquired into adulthood. So a bunch of studies have started to address this question because we are increasingly living in a mobile and multilingual world where people move around. People don't stay in the same place that they grew up in. This is, the case within a country, but also the case internationally where people from a different country come to the US or vice versa. So what happens when you immigrate to a different country and you are there for life, essentially? So a study that addressed this in 2010 was by DeLeo, Schmidt, and Menon. And what they looked at were these long-term immigrants that I just described. So if you are a native German speaker and you immigrate to Canada, and you're there for more than 30 years, or you're a native German speaker and you move to the Netherlands and you're also there for decades, are you still like a native German speaker? Is the central question in this study. And what they did was they basically just recorded people producing German, and then they played those samples of speech to native German speakers still living in Germany, and they asked them, how authentic or how native-like does this person sound as a native German speaker? And what they found was that not everyone, but the majority actually, of these German speakers living abroad don't sound like native speakers anymore. They sound noticeably foreign accent represented, which is significant because these are not people who kind of immigrated when they were children and maybe had not fully acquired or fully learned German by the time they got immersed in this foreign language environment. These are people who are immigrating in their 30s, or what we would normally consider kind of well-formed adults. So basically, that result is suggesting that there's something inherently malleable about even this native language that we feel like we're expert in. Now, those people were in that country for decades, which is a really long time. So maybe there's something about something exceptional about this result because just of the amount of time that they were immersed in a foreign language environment. So what I did was sort of something similar to the DeLeo study, but instead looking at people who are just starting to learn their second language, a foreign language. So these are people who are Americans, young Americans. They've just graduated from college, and they, like many young college graduates, go abroad to do some sort of public service or study abroad program. So these are people who go to Korea to teach English as part of an English teaching program, and part of the training or orientation before they start their year in Korea is to basically learn Korean. So what you notice in these people, where I asked them to pronounce some English words, these are all native English speakers, over the course of their first 5 weeks of learning Korean. So they are literally coming off the plane, and they start their Korean classes, and then I ask them, please say these English words for me. This is your native language, of course. So what you notice is that in this feature of their pronunciation called VOT, and this stands for voice onset time, which basically refers to the amount of aspiration that people produce in their stop consonants. So sounds like P, T, and K in English have this kind of puff of air that comes out. P, T, K has some air that comes out, and you can actually measure that amount of air. Where in English, there's a fair amount of air that comes out, and so there's a lot of voice onset time. Now, in Korean, they're very similar consonants, P, T, and K, but Koreans' P, T, and K are more aspirated. Which is to say that their voice onset time is longer. So when young Americans are immersed in a Korean-speaking environment and they are learning Korean intensely, what happens is even after like 2 weeks of learning Korean, their English is not the way it used to be. And this is sort of a remarkable finding because what it's suggesting is that sort of acquired non-nativeness in a study like DeLeo et al. Is not something about just having to be there for a really long time, but is something about the inherent malleability of the native language system that lends itself to this type of change. So what you're seeing here are 2 lines, both for people who had never studied Korean before, the inexperienced learner group in black, and the red line is the experienced learner group. Even the people for whom Korean is not a new language, when they get into this Korean class, start getting influenced by learning Korean in terms of how they produce their English, which is essentially getting Korean influenced here. Okay, so in any case, that is still, the first language is still being produced with some degree of fluency. And what we'd like to know kind of on a different branch of this research is sort of, if you are someone who has been cut off from your native language for years, because those Americans who came to Korea, they at least consciously remembered knowing English. If you're cut off from your first language for many years, do you really entirely forget it? Because some of this research that we're looking at suggests that even when you start getting exposed to a foreign language, stuff starts happening to your native language that seems to be due to some links that you're forming between the native language and the language that you're learning. So a bunch of research has looked at this, some of which is in psychology and some of which is in linguistics, where a lot of people who are adopted from some other country at a very young age have no conscious recollection of speaking the language that is spoken in the country they were adopted from. And there's various ways to sort of probe how much they know about that language, one of which is hypnosis. Hypnosis can conjure up many memories, but one thing that people have done to sort of examine this memory doesn't involve hypnosis at all, because you don't necessarily have a professional hypnotist every time you want to speak your heritage language. So one thing that people have found is relearning it sort of has this effect of reactivating this language that you didn't even remember that you knew. And so this study that I'll briefly talk about is a study of heritage learners of Spanish. And so these are people who are Latino American for the most part and overheard Spanish when they were growing up, but didn't really learn how to speak it, and they don't really understand Spanish. They don't consciously understand Spanish, they report. So what you see when you compare native Spanish speakers, these childhood overhearers, and then Americans who are just learning Spanish for the first time, these novice learners, when you ask them after some amount of time in a Spanish course to produce some Spanish, and then you submit that speech for foreign accent rating to native Spanish listeners, where 5 is good. 5 is authentic, very native-like Spanish. The native speakers are doing very well, as you would expect, in both the production of individual sounds as well as a fluent narrative. The novice learners are not doing great. They're not quite breaking 3 on the 5-point scale. But the childhood overhearers, they are not patterning like the novice learners. Even though many of them, or basically this is a group that didn't really speak Spanish in their childhood, they kind of only overheard it, they're manifesting this memory or knowledge of their early exposure to Spanish because they are performing significantly differently from the novice learners that is more native-like. Now, they still did get exposed to a lot of Spanish, years of Spanish, and so a different question is, if you don't even remember at all learning this language or hearing it in childhood, does this same sort of advantage express itself? And a different study that looked at this question had to do with Korean adoptees to the US who were adopted generally before the age of 1. So these are people who generally don't even remember knowing Korean at all, as opposed to hearing it for several years, even if not speaking. Where here we're looking at their accuracy of telling that 2 Korean consonants are different. So again, these 3 groups are being examined after a number of weeks of learning Korean, where there's a Korean contrast that's quite difficult typically for English speakers to hear, the so-called lax aspirated contrast, which sounds something like 발 and 팔. Which for most English speakers just sounds like 2 kinds of P, and this also occurs with T and K. So these are consonants that are typically quite difficult for English speakers to tell apart. Novice learners are not super great at doing this, so their accuracy at telling these 2 consonants apart is not quite at 80%. And the native speakers are very good, as you would expect, but the adoptees, what's remarkable about this group that, again, does not consciously remember knowing any Korean, is that they are doing better. Somehow they're doing better than the novice learners, even though they don't remember actually knowing any Korean. So sort of the takeaway from all this is that there's 2 elements of memory, and there's an element of memory in which we can sort of consciously recall that we know something. And then there's an element of memory that we, and people in the literature have referred to as so-called storage strength. So we can kind of distinguish between storage strength and retrieval strength of memory, where maybe you don't ever really forget something, and at least a lot of the studies coming out of this literature suggest that language knowledge, language experience doesn't really completely go away or isn't completely lost. There's just maybe a problem with retrieving it. So the effect in this case of relearning the language in college or any sort of language class is sort of to up the retrieval strength of that knowledge that is still in there somewhere. So sort of when you claim that you forget, you've forgotten your Spanish or you don't remember anything from your high school French, really what you need to be saying is, my retrieval strength for my high school French needs to be upped, or it's low. I need to increase my retrieval strength for French. It's not that you've forgotten it. Thank you.
Thank you for that super interesting talk. So what you ended on, this retrieval strength, is that why if you learned a language and then you forgot a lot of it and then later on you're immersed in a culture that speaks that language, very often you pick it back up very easily?
Exactly. So there have been sort of anecdotes that I've heard from other people where people they know who have been exposed to some language very early in life and then go travel to that country later as an adult. After living there for a little while, even after not necessarily having conversations with people, they'll be in a shop or something and someone asks them a question and they'll just instinctively respond, even though they haven't actually had any conversational interaction up to that point. So yeah, that's very amenable to that type of explanation, that when you're living and exposed to, living around and exposed to a language, that basically what that is doing is upping or increasing the retrieval strength. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, that was awesome and very interesting. So I was raised speaking Portuguese and English. My maternal side is the native language is Portuguese, but like after a certain age, once I was less around it, like going to school more often, I lost a lot of the Portuguese. But I also speak Spanish, which was just taught like through school. And what I found, and this is basically the question, when my Spanish is being used more, I use it a lot at work. When I find that I'm using my Spanish the most, all of those conversations or those things that I thought like I didn't understand in Portuguese, they suddenly start like that gets stronger. Mm-hmm. But obviously, I mean, the languages are similar, that is true, but they're obviously very different. I know personally they're very different. Mm-hmm. So what is it that when I'm around more Spanish kicks in, like my Portuguese gets stronger? How does that work?
So there's a field of research that I haven't talked much about here, but is sort of kind of developing as we speak, called third language acquisition. And the central question in this field has to do with when you're learning a third language, how is that influenced and how does it influence the languages that you've learned before, so your second language and your first language. And a big concern and matter of debate in that literature is the influence or role that some sort of perceived similarity between the languages that you speak or know has, where there's a lot of arguments going on now where some people say things like, you have some overall judgment for how Portuguese sounds in relation to Spanish, that these two languages sound overall kind of similar, and that's the basis of the judgment that you make, and that's maybe the basis for why when you speak Spanish or get exposed to Spanish, it kind of conjures up Portuguese. And then there's a different set of theories in this field that says something about not necessarily the specific features that make one language seem like another, but just kind of centers around their status. So in particular, after you past a certain age, any language that you learn is marked as like not your native one. This is a foreign language. And so a set of studies in this field has kind of tested the hypothesis that even if languages are not actually similar to each other, so we could take a couple of very different languages like Mandarin and French, for example. So these languages sound quite different, but if someone learns both of those languages later in life, there's a tendency, some people have argued, for those languages to influence each other because they share, even though they don't share like phonetic similarities, for example, what they share is a similar status in the mind of the speaker as both being foreign. So there's a variety of theories as to how sort of languages are related to each other cognitively. One of them has to do with some actual linguistic features that make the languages behave or sound similar, and another set of theories has to do with kind of the timing of their acquisition and whether they're kind of considered to be foreign.
Hi, Professor.
Hello.
I have him 2 times today, so he's great. I was curious just because I haven't read a lot of literature in the storage strength that you mentioned, and I was curious as a future, hopefully, educator, what type of implications are like the researchers putting forth for like education like earlier on for children, and like how can the knowledge of what we have about storage strength really drive like foreign language learning and education in America?
Yeah, that's a great question. One set of studies that I haven't talked about is kind of investigating the idea that that maybe there's an age, like a critical age, up to which if you are exposed robustly to a language, if you kind of move somewhere else or you get disconnected from contact with that language, the skills that you developed up to that point will sort of remain in place. And so this is kind of the idea of storage strength, where there's some evidence to suggest that like if you learn a language up to early adolescence, like age 12, you could be, pretty much removed from that language and still continue to hear it sort of like a native speaker. And so that has the implication of parents maybe deciding on a particular timing for their child to either enter mainstream education or enter bilingual education. And so I guess the results of that literature aren't so clear, because I guess one thing that we're finding from that set of studies is that there isn't one age for everything. So you may need to be exposed to a language up to a later age to kind of maintain authentic pronunciation, but maybe to speak natively in terms of forming sentences and just general fluency, you need to learn up to a different age. So that's kind of, I guess, one of the complicating factors of that literature, because maybe there are different critical ages for all different sorts of aspects of language.
Hi, thanks again for the talk. I really enjoyed it. So I was wondering, just for the studies, how old, like what the age ranges were for the adoptees as well as the childhood.
Sure. So so in the first study that was on Spanish, the childhood overhearers, they are hearing Spanish for several years. So basically, they're hearing Spanish for the most part, at least for the first 3 years, and many of them hear Spanish up until they go to kindergarten. And the source of that Spanish is often not their parents, but like kind of someone who is a housekeeper or helping out in the house somehow, a nanny. Basically, when they go to school, then they don't need a nanny anymore. So then they get cut off from that language. So they've been learning, or they've been exposed to that language for several years. But in the study on the Korean adoptees, those people have been exposed to Korean really only for a few months. So I think the latest age is a year, but on average, those adoptees, I think, are being adopted around 4 or 5 months. So really, most of them don't remember knowing anything about Korean. Thank you.